For a moment, as SLS finally rolled out of the assembly building and out into the light, I, like many space enthusiasts, allowed myself to get optimistic, to start falling in love with this rocket again, as difficult as the whole thing may have been. Artemis 1 has been a comedy of errors year after year, delay after delay, glitch after glitch, and billions upon billions of dollars of cost overruns. And yet, for a moment, I allowed myself to believe that the process was almost over, that the wet rehearsal was about to go through, hopefully without a hitch, and we would have a launch perhaps in May or early June, which would be entirely too late, but better late than never, right? Right? Well, no. Florida is widely recognized as being the lightning capital of the world, and for very good reason, especially at this time of year. And as you get further into summer, things start to get worse. It gets so swelteringly hot in Florida, and as you have all of that evaporation and all of that humidity, afternoon and evening thunderstorms become an extremely common thing. It's something that I used to actually wish for every time I went to Disney World in the summer, but lightning storms have been a reality at Kennedy Space Center for an extremely long period of time. As you can see right here, the Space Shuttle had to deal with it on a regular basis. Now, we have no idea as to whether or not the recent lightning strikes to the lightning defense system, which is supposed to be far better than anything that the shuttle had anything to do with the failures. But one thing we do know is that in spite of all of the long series of testing, in spite of the relative simplicity of this rocket compared to all of the other things that we're working on right now, because let's be honest, it's essentially just a modified space shuttle, we are continuing to have difficulties, challenges, delays, and cost overruns, and it's just going to get worse as time goes on. And to be frank, we are running out of time. This rocket cannot stay stacked for a whole lot longer, certainly not any longer than midsummer. And if we continue to have issues with this rocket, as we have had with the Boeing Starliner, that is to say, jammed valves that last for months and months without being repaired, it means that we are in danger of this project becoming an unmitigated failure in spite of all of our efforts. And I'm going to cover the whole ugly story of how we got here in just a moment. Now, the thing that's always made me the angriest about the SLS is the factor that really should be its greatest strength, the fact that it's based off of technology that we've been using for an extremely long period of time, proven technology that was used over and over again on the Space Shuttle, and in many ways, this is actually a much simpler rocket than the Space Shuttle was. The solid rocket boosters are a little bit bigger than what the shuttle used, but they don't have to be reused. No parachutes, nothing that needs to be built into the design for reusability. So really, they are a lot more straightforward. The hydrogen tank that contains the vast majority of the fuel and oxidizer, the big orange tank, remains essentially the same. There are 4 RS-25 engines instead of 3, so a little bit of a difference there, but overall, the whole bottom part, the first stage of this rocket, is essentially a big space shuttle, a simplified space shuttle. So the new additions that have been made to the rocket are the ICPS and the Orion. So one would assume that these are the things that might have been holding it up. But that is not the case. The ICPS has been at the Cape since 2018, ready to go. There's really no problem with that. As a matter of fact, the whole meaning of ICPS, interim cryogenic propulsion stage, means that it's an interim stage. It's designed for something better to replace it. In the last 4+ years of development, one would have assumed that they would have the replacement by now, since this whole behemoth was supposed to launch in 2018, but they don't. The first stage has really been what's holding this whole damn thing up. The Orion hasn't been a problem either. It flew to orbit a very long time ago. The abort system was tested a very long time ago. Everything on this rocket is ready to go. The first stage is really what has been holding it up for all of this time. And to be fair, the first stage is not holding it up right now. It is, as you'll see later on, a valve on the upper stage, not a part of the launch tower as we were originally told. It is a problem with the rocket. And this, of course, begs the question, what the hell is the problem with these valves? Because, as you may recall, this very same problem has caused problems with the Starliner for such a long period of time that they had to swap out the service module completely and delay the launch for at least a year, if not longer. If this happens with SLS, it will be an unmitigated disaster simply because you can't leave it stacked for that long. Probably July or August is the latest that you can reasonably leave this rocket stacked before it's going to start becoming a problem. And the longer it gets delayed, of course, the more it costs. But this should hardly come as a surprise to any of us, because this rocket has been delayed no less than 16 damn times during its history, and there have been so many things that have delayed it. For example, the solid rocket boosters, the thing that should have been the simplest part of this project, actually was amazingly complicated to begin with. NASA actually had what was called an advanced booster competition at the beginning of SLS development. Did you ever hear about this competition? No, me either. However, Aerojet and Teledyne Brown proposed 3 booster engines, each with dual combustion chambers, a very different kind of system, and then you had Alliant Tech Systems, and they had a solid rocket booster with a different sort of casing and a different kind of propellant, 4 segments instead of 5. And then you had Pratt & Whitney Rocketdyne, as they were called back then, together with Dynetics, and they had a liquid-fueled booster, which was called Pyreos. So you had these alternatives to the modified orbital ATK shuttle booster. However, all of them were discarded. As a matter of fact, the entire project and the entire competition was canceled, and then they just went back to the old shuttle boosters because they thought that that would be simpler. Well, maybe so, but NASA paid for a great deal of research on the part of all of these competitors in this supposed contest, all for nothing. And this is just one example of many foobarred things that have happened with this rocket, and I have run out of patience with this, as I think all of you can probably tell. But all you have to do to get really frustrated is to go back into the news archives of SLS to see some of the ridiculous estimates that were made by NASA at the time. For example, in November 8th of 2017, NASA set a date in December of 2019 2016 for the first SLS launch, and that was after they had a tornado that impacted their assembly facility in Louisiana. So there were a number of things that were already impacting SLS development and construction. They were also having difficulties welding the core stage at the time, but still they were optimistic that the rocket was going to be launched 3 years ago, and that was in 2017. It's very difficult to understand just how this project has gotten so screwed up over such a considerable period of time, aside from the fact that Boeing is the one that's running it. Boeing has just been a company characterized by an ongoing comedy of errors, no matter what product they're putting out, from airliners to the Starliner to SLS. Everything associated with this damn company has ended up being a complete nightmare over the last 1 to 2 decades. And according to NASA's Office of Inspector General, it's not just a matter of delays, it's a matter of unsustainable cost overruns. Every one of the first 4 Artemis missions are going to be running $4.1 billion per launch. Quote, a price tag that strikes us as unsustainable, unquote, according to the NASA Inspector General Paul Martin. So even if this thing does get off the ground, it's going to be incredibly difficult to fund. Now, granted, the first 3 rockets or so have been essentially paid for by now, and the 4th one has already been partially paid for. All of them are being assembled, so it would stand to reason that we should just keep going, at least with the rockets that are being assembled. But here's one of the biggest problems as far as I'm concerned. It's a damn good thing that Congress has a very short memory when it comes to cost estimates on this rocket. Back in 2011, when the SLS project was first rolled out, it was estimated that each launch would run about $500 million. That's right, $500 million, which means the per launch cost has ballooned 8-fold in a decade. This is simply unacceptable, and something that, if Congress eventually goes through their files and figures all of this out, could easily lead to the cancellation of this project. Any project that goes that far over budget per launch is going to come under intense scrutiny, and if Artemis gets canceled, our return to the moon is going to be delayed very considerably. I mean, when it comes down to Elon Musk and his ambitions to go to the moon and to Mars and such, there are many, many things that he needs to do besides building the most powerful rocket in human history to transport humans to other planets. I'm sorry, but that's just the case. We are not going to be going back to the moon by 2025 or 2026, or indeed, in my opinion, by the end of this decade if Artemis fails, and that's something we dare not allow. And yet, in spite of all this, there have been times that NASA and SLS has seduced us, has toyed with us, has led us to believe that we're on the verge of going back to the moon. The green run, I think, was the moment that almost turned me around, especially given that I got to observe it in person, to watch these engines burn for as long as they did. I mean, it was a tremendous static fire. 8 minutes and 20 seconds, far longer than anything that SpaceX does, and it created its own weather, its own rainstorms. It was an unbelievable thing to witness, and something that gave me a little bit of hope, a little bit of optimism, because after all, the RS-25s were performing just fine, the solid rocket boosters were performing just fine, the ICPS SLS was already out at Cape Canaveral. The Orion and its abort system, its life support systems, everything about that looked nominal. Everything about the rocket looked optimistic, and this was over a year ago. So there was every reason to believe that when SLS was finally delivered to the Cape, that things were going to finally go to plan. Everything was being stacked, test after test was going through without a hitch. Everything was looking good for a launch by the end of 2021, but then it just didn't. Then it went to February, and then to March, and then all the way till now, with no wet rehearsal having happened, and now a scaled back wet rehearsal being scheduled again because of a valve issue that may have been caused by weather or maybe not. But if it was caused by weather, that's going to be a very serious long-term problem. Because if there's something about these valves that make them vulnerable to bad weather, that's something that's going to create lots of long-term issues with this rocket. And contrary to popular belief, this problem occurred in the rocket itself and not in the launch platform. It was a problem with a helium check valve in the interim cryogenic propulsion stage, the ICPS, that's been sitting out at the Cape since 2018. The valve prevents helium used to purge propellant lines and drain propellant from escaping from the rocket. They found a problem to maintain helium purge pressure in the ICPS after changing out a regulator in the mobile launch platform. At the time, they were able to restore normal pressure, so they were able to get around the issue, but they don't know what the source of the problem is. Does that sound familiar? Yeah, it's kind of like what happened to Starliner, and the problem has been linked solidly to the faulty valve in the ICPS itself. And obviously SLS cannot fly without the ICPS, and who knows how long it's going to take to repair the valve. In the meantime, they're doing a scaled back wet rehearsal to limit the amount of liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen propellant loaded into the ICPS during the wet dress rehearsal. That being the case, only minimal propellant operations will be performed on the ICPS, which is not sufficient for a full-fledged wet dress rehearsal. But at the same time, this is probably the best solution simply because they can't leave the rocket sitting out there forever while they try to fix this one damn valve, or at least determine why it caused a problem in the first place. There are 25 critical events, as they are called, in the terminal phase of countdown, from T-minus 10 minutes to the cutoff of a wet dress rehearsal, which happens at about T-minus 10 seconds. Only 2 of them are specific to the ICPS. So presumably, NASA is going to check 23 of these 25 events during the scaled back rehearsal, and then try to figure out what the hell is going on with ICPS. Will they be able to perform a separate wet dress rehearsal on the ICPS, or are they going to have to carry out another full-fledged wet dress rehearsal once they fix the damn thing? Well, we know the answer to part of that question. John Blevins, who is NASA's SLS chief engineer, has said that a separate tanking exercise cannot be carried out with the ICPS. Now, does that mean that we need another wet dress rehearsal? Well, maybe not. According to Blevins, he says, quote, "If that missing data was the only missing data and every model acted perfectly, I think we would look long and hard as to whether we needed to or not, if we're talking about a separate wet dress rehearsal." So maybe it's not required, but at the same time, is NASA really gonna take that kind of a chance? Are they going to try to launch this beast without a full-fledged wet dress rehearsal on every single stage, regardless of the data that they have available? And in the meantime, launch windows are getting pushed out further and further. The current launch window of June 6th to June 16th is starting to look almost impossible. Then you have June 29th to July 17th and July 26th to August 9th. After that, things start getting very problematic about leaving this rocket stacked without launching it. But here's the bottom line as far as I'm concerned, and to be quite honest, I think we should be getting started on this right now. We need to have a parallel development path for an alternative to SLS, as this rocket continues to present us with one problem after another and a gradually exploding budget. We really need to seriously look at the possibility of Falcon Heavy taking Orion and the ICPS all the way out to the moon. Theoretically, it has the capability to do this in a variety of different configurations, and this is not the only solution, but it is the simplest. It would require a lot of additional engineering. The Falcon Heavy is not a human-rated rocket yet, and it would take a considerable amount of effort with its current fairing and everything else in order to allow it to carry everything that Orion needs. But as far as its capacity is concerned, its payload and everything else, as I've mentioned in previous videos, this is a rocket that could theoretically do the job, and for a hell of a lot less money. We're talking a little over $100 million instead of over $4 billion. Think of how many launches we could theoretically carry out and send to the moon on an annual basis if we were looking at that kind of cost as opposed to $4 billion per launch. It would change everything for Artemis. And honestly, if this fails, if we have to unstack Artemis, this is something that we should seriously start looking at, especially since NASA has already called for a less expensive alternative to SLS as it is anyway. But have I already given up on SLS? Not just yet. All of these years of work, all of these years of development and billions of dollars invested, I certainly don't want to flush SLS down the toilet unless it's absolutely necessary. There are things that this rocket can do theoretically that no other rocket can do, and if we can get it off the ground in the next couple of months, which I still hope that we can, then there is hope, at least in the short term, that SLS can power Artemis until we have a viable replacement. I certainly hope that that's the case, as opposed to us scrambling to find a replacement because the original one flat out failed, which unfortunately is starting to look more and more probable every day. If you like my videos, if you like this content, please subscribe to my channel and check out the description. There are many ways to support me, and there are many benefits to supporting me, including a series of short videos about things that make me really angry that you may have noticed, and some of these videos are reserved exclusively for my Discord supporters. So supporting me has many benefits in addition to keeping this channel going. So if you would like to see that happen, feel free to join up with my community. And as always, stay angry about space!